And now I'd like to introduce someone that many of you already know. Our speaker today is Dr. Fred Johnson III, and he is the Guy Vanderjack Endowed Professor of History at Hope College. And he has been on the faculty there since 2000. He has a BA from Bowie State University and an MA and a PhD from Kent State, and also an MDiv from Western Theological Seminary. He served in the U.S. Marine Corps before he started his career in higher education. His primary fields of study are 19th century U.S. history, specifically the Civil War, also 20th century U.S. history, U.S. military history, and African history. His topic today is very important to us, and we know that by the numbers. We had 100 people sign up for this class, and many of them have to stay at home because they weren't able to get a seat inside the classroom today. So we're looking forward to hearing Dr. Fred Johnson talk to us about our eyes on Europe, the rise of nationalization. Please welcome Dr. Fred Johnson.
Thanks, Kit, as usual, for that very gracious introduction. And thank you to you all. Some of you all are probably aware of the fact that I lost my oldest son in early May. So for those of you who've been praying for me, please keep doing so. And if you haven't, please start, because people have told me that there's nothing worse that can happen to a parent, and that is it. So thank you for all you've been doing. Thank you for your support. Today I have with me my younger sister, Carolyn. Carolyn, say hello to Hass. Hass, say hello to Carolyn. I brought her here to prove to her that there are people in this community that actually like me. So like Kit said, the rise of nationalism in Europe. Well, let's start here. Of course, this is a problematic thing. And of course, like any other history class, I'm going to tell you about the nationalism, but also set the table for its origins, to establish proper context on a large scale, to understand just exactly what this means right now in the 21st century in this moment. From an article from Harvard Review or Harvard News from 2017, which may as well be today. Bear with me as I read. Over the past 75 years, many Western Europe nations have moved steadily toward cooperation and interconnectedness as their shared economic and political interests converged during this period called globalization. That came about as a direct byproduct of the destruction of not just World War II. Understand, World War II was just a part two of World War I. So from 1914 to 1945, the world went through about 41 years of chaos, destruction, frenzy, bloodletting, slaughter. So nearly a half century of that, the world was ready for a different formula. And now it's come down to a point of being either globalism versus nationalism. To understand this fully, though, we got to take time travel back to May 8, 1945. On May 8, 1945, by May 1945, the curtain was coming down fast on Nazi Europe, Nazi Germany, and Nazi-occupied Europe especially. This is drawing from the Battle of Stalingrad, showing Nazi troops marching into the death's head, literally, from the Battle of Stalingrad from November 1942 to February 1943, when Stalingrad, that one city named after Stalin, city of Stalin, did not fall. And Hitler's offensive war machine came to a complete crashing halt. Wasn't over yet, but it came to a stop. Just like midway in the Pacific brought the Japanese to a stop, likewise, Stalingrad had an effect on the Nazi war machine. These two are the chief culprits for all the murder, slaughter, inhumanity for Europe. Never let people tell you that one leader can't make a difference. One did in Italy, one did in Europe. As it was combined, they proved to be disastrous for humanity. The one on the left, Benito Mussolini. The one on the right, Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Nazi Germany. Theirs wasn't just nationalism, theirs was hyper-nationalism. Born out of the stresses of the Great Depression, born out of the stresses of the 1919 Versailles Treaty, born out of this idea, especially for the one on the right, Mussolini, who said that democracy and liberal democracy has seen its day. That's something an outgrowth of the 19th century and the Enlightenment. Time for a more heavy-handed approach, so they said. In other words, people were saying, we want autocrats. I cannot imagine why people would say that, but that's what they did. Because the Great Depression was, in summation, an absolutely emblematic symbol of things not working. September 1, 1939, Nazi forces rolled into Poland. You all are probably aware of the August 22nd, 1939 agreement between Nazi Germany's Adolf Hitler and the Soviet Union's Joseph Stalin, where the Soviets decided that the Soviets agreed to take the eastern half of Poland, the Germans took the western half of Poland, and so from 1939 until 1989, Poland ceased to exist as a country independently. Because after World War II, of course, the Russians will come in and dominate the whole country. It'll be communist for about another 30, 40 years. So from 1939 to 1945, Europe descended into darkness. There's no other way of putting it. I'm going to borrow Winston Churchill's phrase, into utter moral and human darkness. There's no way it could be anything other than that with places like Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Treblinka, Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, all those death camps. People don't do that unless there's some type of darkness and evil going through the land. But of course, on May 7th, 1945, about 6 years later, the news came out that the Germans had surrendered. Winston Churchill called this up. Well, Winston Churchill went on the radio and broadcasted to the entire world. And of course, hearing the voice of the prime minister that led the British people through the Blitz of 1940, and then the evacuation of Dunkirk, and then the long dark days of the North African campaign, and on and on and on, even the War of the Pacific, Winston Churchill's voice was a very, very welcome reminder that things finally were changing. So it was VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. And you don't need to have any kind of interpretation on these smiles. They speak for themselves. Young people, American servicemen and women, were glad that they were going to get a chance at being alive. But the aftermath, in the aftermath of the war, Europe was obviously in a terrible state. Understand that it wasn't just the German war machine, because the German war machine was devastating enough, but in addition to that, it was the Allied bombing campaign from 1942 to 1945. That is, the 8th Air Force by the Americans, plus the 14th Air Force, the 10th Air Force, and the British Royal Air Force, all bombing Germany as much as they could to eliminate the possibility of making war by destroying the means and capability of producing weapons of war. For example, in August and October 1943, the Americans launched a bombing raid against a place called Schweinfurt in Regensburg in Germany. The target wasn't German bombs, not German planes, not German boats, not German ships and submarines, ball bearings. You know why? Because without ball bearings, wheels don't spin. Without ball bearings, propellers don't spin. Without ball bearings, tank tracks don't spin around. So no ball bearings, when those things wear out, and they always wear out, you can't replace them. That means the Wehrmacht comes to a stop. No more armored warfare, no more Luftwaffe. The planes are grounded. The German war machine comes to a complete stop. The 8th Air Force took a pounding from that. That's the kind of infrastructure that the Americans are going after. Not to mention in August 1943, they also went after a place called Ploiești in Romania, an oil producing facility. No gas, no movement. No gas, no flight. The bombing did its job. All over Europe, buildings that had once been hallowed places of culture and gathering have been turned into nightmare zones. This very famous picture of the Soviet soldier holding a flag out over Berlin during either Yalta or one of the later conferences of the war. The decision had been made to let the Russians have Berlin, since after all, they had suffered the most during World War II. I think the saying is that World War II was won by British ingenuity, American money, and Russian blood. The Russians lost over 20 million people of their citizens during World War II. And yet people may feel about the Russians that they do today, but the fact of the matter is the Russians took a serious bleeding during World War II. But even while it was time to celebrate in Europe, in the meantime, there's still that thing going on in the Pacific called the Pacific War, December 7, 1941. So the Japanese dismayed, but we still had June, July, and August, so 90 days of warfare in the Pacific. Now, 90 days may not seem like such a long time in the backdrop of 6 years, But think about that. If your loved one's in the Pacific in that 90-day period, and you've been watching the Japanese fight since 1941, you know 90 days can take a lot of people out. If you fight in the Japanese army, because they're not giving up 1 inch of ground without taking a lot of people with them, and they didn't. But on August 6, 1945, the Americans introduced something to humanity called nuclear warfare. And I tell my students all the time that, you know, there are a few times in history when you can set up and point to a single moment when everything changed. August 6, 1945, when Enola Gay opened his bomb bay doors and dropped that bomb, when that flashing light came and that mushroom cloud went into the upper atmosphere, everything changed as far as how human beings have been killing each other for millennia. This introduced a brand new way of destruction. Warfare can no longer be the same way anymore. And this is saying something because in World War I, that war was called not just the Great War, but the war to, like Woodrow Wilson said, to protect democracy. But you all know the phrase, they call it the war to do what? The war to end all wars. That's 1914 to 1918, well before nuclear weapons. So they accomplished that, the war to end all wars, just with conventional weapons. That is machine guns, submarines, gas, tanks, and airplanes. 5 brand new weapon systems and flamethrowers. Imagine that. Now, one new weapon system in any war is enough to cause humanity to have a jolt. But 5 brand new weapon systems in one conflict in 4 years? And keep in mind that the generals fighting this war in 1914, none of them had been born before 1900. So these are 19th century individuals who are used to horses and cavalry charges and so forth, fighting with brand new modern weapons. They got to have a learning curve to figure out how to use these weapons. So a general needing a learning curve means that lots of young people die. That's how they learn. That's why at the end of World War II, the world had been shocked to its collective nervous system. So the war ended. This is one of my favorite pictures showing the celebration in the World War II. I think I told you all before that NPR was trying to find the sailor that kissed this woman, and they didn't find him, but they found the nurse. And when they heard, I think the recording was, she said, "Oh, dearie, I don't know who he was, but he was a good kisser." So here's the question. After that kind of trauma and destruction in Europe and the Pacific, and nuclear weapons now, understand that in Hiroshima, the one bomb killed 180,000 people. That's a new way of killing people. Now, what do? We have peace, but now the job of maintaining it and establishing a peace that will get money, health, prosperity, and wealth. People said, let us establish a post-war system that will handle all these things so that people can make money, people can have health, people can have prosperity and wealth. In other words, countries that are interconnected and sharing in the wealth, sharing in the health, and being prosperous together and being wealthy together are more unlikely to fight each other because they'll jeopardize all that stuff. Who wants to lose money, health, prosperity, and wealth? No one wants to lose that stuff. So let us establish a post-war system that will, if not enshrine it, at least protect it better. But of course, at the end of World War II is a thing called the Cold War. Before the dust settled and the smoke cleared after World War II, the Cold War, that is the Soviet bear, the American eagle, were already at each other's throats. So the Cold War started in 1945 and would not end until 1989, 1990, the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, I had a video clip in here, the Voice of America, but let's go ahead and roll forward on this. One way of establishing peace in the post-war world was to make sure that propaganda machines, they're going to exist because behind the Iron Curtain, that is with the Soviets in the East Bloc and the American side in the West. So the Voice of America was established in 1942 during World War II to offset Nazi propaganda, which had been powerful. That is American news and information, sports, weather, business, anything from the United States to offset the trash being thrown to the German people and Nazi-occupied Europe. Likewise, into the Cold War, the Voice of America continued still providing what? Sports news, weather, regular, mundane, everyday news, because people in the East Bloc were not allowed to have free speech. The Voice of America stood for free speech. I know what the Voice of America did personally because I spent an entire summer working at a Voice of America station in Carysburg, Liberia, just outside of Monrovia. What was their target? The Kersburg radio station in Africa and West Africa was pointed toward Eastern Europe. Big, wide parabolic dishes just broadcasting information of any kind from American news sources. American news, was the propaganda? Probably, but it was there to do what? Counterbalance the silence and the other stuff being pumped out by Cuba and the Soviet Union in Moscow. And people listened on shortwave radios. People tuned into the Voice of America because it gave them an alternative, and it let them know that in America, you too could you could speak your mind and even had the power to criticize the government and not be hauled off at night. So if nothing else, it provided that assurance that in America, free speech reigned. Also, another thing was established called Radio Free Europe. That's Louis Armstrong, by the way. Radio Free Europe. Well, also, Radio Free Europe was established as an adjunct to the Voice of America to do the same thing. When I was a kid growing up on the Air Force Base in the Philippines, they used to have commercials on Armed Forces television all the time, talking about the VOA and Radio Free. I used to love listening to those commercials because they would always show, somebody behind in East Germany, behind the Berlin Wall, listening to their little radio. And just gave you the sense that America was doing the right thing, that we were telling a story that they would not get otherwise. So information, Radio Free Europe, the VOA, and also because there's such destruction and homelessness and refugees moving across Europe at the end of World War II, George Catlett Marshall was the Army Chief of Staff, eventually became Harry Truman's Secretary of State. So in 1947, the Congress passed the European Recovery Act, also known as the Marshall Plan. Y'all have heard of that. The Marshall Plan had one thought in mind: to rebuild Europe physically, to rebuild physical infrastructure, but also to feed people, house them, clothe them. Because the memory of that generation still was current news of the Great Depression was that people who are hungry, homeless and cold, and without homes get desperate. And little kids that are hungry don't know to not cry. They just know, I'm hungry, Mom, Dad, and you're supposed to take care of me. So this was billions of dollars pumped into the Western European economy to feed people, house them, clothe them, and set them on the path towards some type of economic recovery. And also, if something just as big was this: if people are being fed like that from the West, meaning tying Washington's economy and the European economy together, tied them together into an economic block. Follow me so far? So if they all have one thing in mind, they all commonly on the same dollar, drawn from the same source, they have more in common with each other that brings them closer together economically, and then socially, then politically and ideologically. And it does something else also. It offsets the lure from the Soviet Union. Listen to us, we'll give you food, we'll give you clothing, everybody over here will be equal. No, so it's offset Soviet possibilities. And the Russians did make that offer. In fact, one of the reasons why the Russians will cut off East Berlin is because the European Recovery Act is working so well, or people are fleeing from East Berlin to West Berlin, not because they're trying to go on vacation, but because they want to get out from under Soviet repression. So in 1948, the Russians blocked off land access to West Berlin, which is why the British and the Americans responded by engaging in a round-the-clock operation called Operation Vittles. We know it as the Berlin Airlift, where for one solid year, American and British planes flew supplies of coal, oil, food, medicine, the normal things people need to live. Round-the-clock flights, sometimes landing within 30 seconds of each other, into West Berlin, into Tempelhof Airport. It was a public relations victory for the Americans and a public relations nightmare for the Russians. And it showed people in the post-war world just exactly how terrible things are going to be if the Soviet Union had its way and was in charge. So that way, it showed clearly that the Russians are willing to starve people, keep them homeless, keep them sick, and watch them die for an ideological goal. Whereas the Americans and the British, they will bring in the supplies you need to stay alive and keep them free. Another thing that happened in the 1940s to try and meld these unions together was NATO in 1949. The most famous part of the NATO treaty is Article 5. An attack upon one is an attack upon all. Because the League of Nations from 1919 to 1939 proved it had been nothing more than just a piece of paper to wipe your nose with. I'm gonna say something else, but. So the League of Nations is supposed to have that same principle. If I attack you, then a bunch of you will gang up on me and offset my power, make me back down, or maybe just disengage altogether. Article 5 said, we're not going through that again. The League of Nations did not work. So as a lesson from Versailles, to say Versailles was the treaty that allowed Hitler to march into existence. So after Versailles, they established not only the League of Nations, but now the United Nations. Talk about the League of Nations updated, plus NATO as a further assurance. And then I talked about Radio Free Europe in 1950. It was established as an adjunct to the Voice of America. But, you know, we're talking about European nationalism. Where does this exactly come from? So we understand how World War II produced all these different events in radio and free speech and, you know, meeting people's needs to help humanity recover itself and to put people on the path toward recovery. But what about nationalism itself? One picture I did not, I forgot to give this to Amy. I found a picture last night where in one bombed out city in Germany, there's a sign that says, "Hey, Americans, give us something to eat or we won't forget Hitler." That's from 1946. Let me say it again. Hey, Americans, give us something to eat or we won't forget Hitler. Look, whatever else you can say about Hitler, he was a vile, horrible monster. Let's just get that out there. That's well known, but just to say it. Hitler came to power by doing what? Offering a very simple solution to very complex problems, which is what nationalism is. He said, hungry, I'll feed you. Jobless, I'll employ you. Homeless, I'll house you. Naked, I'll clothe you. Just look to me in the state. I'll do it all. And then it didn't help that many people looked at, he's actually doing it. To the point there were many Americans saying like, well, it can't be all that bad. He's helping the Germans recover. Of course, it was more complex than that. But when the man's rhetoric begins to match it with reality, well, then what do you do to that? And again, people who are hungry, it's like this in Africa. What I said, one of my colleagues in Kenya said, it's the politics of the stomach, all right? A hungry man does not ask where the food comes from. He simply takes the plate. I don't care, you know, if you're a communist feeding me and I'm hungry, guess what? Fine, you want me to be a communist? There I am. If you're a capitalist, I'll be with you too. But nationalism came from a very odd source. Got to go back a little bit further, so bear with me. First things first, we got to go back to France in 1789. Stay with me. Stay with me. Okay, so, you know, 1789, there's a thing called the French Revolution. The French had an absolutist king. Now, the English had already gone through something called the Glorious Revolution in the late 1700s. But here it is 1789, and the French, the people won. They're poor, they're illiterate. They have fought in 2 wars that they've lost. The French and Indian War, where they lost all the North American colonies, and the American Revolution, where they supported the Americans' bid to get independent from Great Britain. So the Americans won their revolution, but in both instances, the French lost their North American colonies, and then the Americans, being a young nation, did not have the money to pay them back. So now you have a king who is a nice guy, but his favorite thing to do during the day is fix clocks. Louis XVI. And people are being disappeared off the street and thrown into a thing called the Bastille. Not a lot of people, but that was the rumor. So unemployment, 2 lost wars, people being taxed who could least afford it. Does this sound familiar to you? And they lost their North American colonies, and then the Americans have gotten independent from Great Britain, which is great for the Americans. It's the French way of poking them in the eye with their thumb. But what are you getting out of this? Economic disruption, illiteracy, and an absolute king, no civil liberties, no freedom of speech. In 1789, ironically enough, the same year that the American Constitution will go into effect, will be ratified. So things are looking pretty bad in France. So the people rise up and revolt and say, you know what, enough is enough. Louis XVI, as you can see, not a very inspiring leader. He ended up getting what I call his head involuntarily separated from his neck by the guillotine. Now, here's the thing, in 1789, a lot of European nations like Russia, the Habsburg Empire, that would be Germany one day, the Prussians, the Spanish, the nation that'll be Italy one day, all those nations are ruling their people the same way that they have been in France. The only real constitutional democracy in Europe in 1789 is England, and they're trying to figure out how to do it. But France is absolute rule, just like in Russia, Prussia, the Saxonies, the Schleswig-Holstein, and all these areas, and in future Italy, and in Spain. Absolute dictatorial kings, all power. It's an age where divine right kingship, that is, God put me on the throne, so you don't want to remove me, right? Because you're going to offend God. So they keep him on the throne. Well, when the French people cut off the king's head in 1793, all these rulers who are operating the same way, they say, we got a problem. Yeah, you do. Yes, you do. Because the French people, they're starting to send emissaries out, and across Europe, in European capitals, they go like, you know what? If the same thing happens here that happened in France, my head's on my head is on the block too. So guess what they do? They gang up all these European powers, gang up on France, and decide to contain the ideology, contain the revolution. Well, the French people, see, we don't want these people ganging up on our borders. And so the church, the French Catholic Church, which did not want to change at all, wanted to keep the king in place. They said, we can't ally with the church because they were the reason why we have this thing in the first place. So what happens is that the French people formed something called the FRA, the French Revolutionary Army, to go to war with all their different European enemies. That means to suppress and contain the revolution. Well, in the process of that happening in 1799, 10 years later, there's somebody that rises through the ranks. Well, that conflict, his name is Napoleon Bonaparte. Ever heard of him? Napoleon is the military genius. He says, don't worry. Napoleon is a man of his time. He knows how to wage war. That's his business, and he's good at it. So Napoleon starts taking the war, not from just waging inside of France, but taking it across the borders to Prussia, to Russia, which would be his undoing, but also to other parts, even as far south as Egypt. And here's the thing, where the French Revolution goes, when Napoleon's armies go, what travels with them is their ideology. So they take the ideology to Prussia and Spain and Egypt. Anywhere the French army goes under the command of Napoleon, they take with them what? Liberty, fraternity, equality. Liberty, fraternity, equality. Three things that do not exist in European capitals prior to 1789. And so it has an effect. You know, why do you think people speak English around the world? Do you think that in Mauritania, 300 years ago, people were speaking English? No. They're speaking French today. There's different ways of exerting power other than through the barrel of a gun. That's one method of power. But if I can walk into your living room and say, what do you speak? Well, I speak Senegalese. No, you don't, not anymore. From now on, you're going to speak French. No, I'm not. And you're going to worship my God. No, I won't. And then about a century later, you're speaking what? French? Worshiping my God? Guess who won? Not you. As Africans say, when Europeans arrived on the continent, we had the land, they had the Bible. By the time it was over with, we had the Bible, they had the land. That's how that worked. So when the French army traveled, the ideology and ideas of the revolutionary movement, we don't want a king anymore. We want a republic. We want what the Americans had. Now the French won't get that, of course, under Napoleon. He'll crown himself emperor. But that, of course, is the problem with revolutions. You can't contain them once they start. So by 1810, all these countries that are under French control, some allied with France, some directly controlled by France, all these countries have been invaded by French, and they have the French revolutionary ideology in them. And so what is the ideology? Nationalism. Because when French people say, like, we got rid of the king, we have sidelined the church. So now what are you fighting for? We're not fighting for the church because they held us up. We're not fighting for the king because he lost his head. What are you fighting? I'm fighting for France. I'm fighting for French culture, French language, French history, French nationalism, the French nation, nationalism, belief system, ism, nationalism. They take that pride of nation with them. Now, it's not anymore about, I used to fight for the king, I'm not fighting for the chiefs. Now I'm fighting for France. Vive la France. So it's an ideology that emphasizes loyalty, devotion, or allegiance to a nation or nation state and holds that such obligations outweigh other individual or group interests. Brought to you by Napoleon Bonaparte. One definition I found said, it teaches you to take pride in stuff you haven't done and hate people you've never met. You all don't know how long it took me to get that word stuff over the real word. I'll let you work on that. So that's the origins of nationalism. So back to the 21st century. Why is this happening? Why is nationalism rising in Europe? The political winds are shifting, and there are signs of a new age of populism and nationalism emerging in Europe, a development that eventually could undermine post-war security and unity. Oh, wait. Why would you want to undermine a system that's established specifically to make people enjoy as much as they can wealth, health, prosperity, and peace? Not a perfect peace, but more than you found from 1914 to 1945. If you really want to be specific about it, from 1877, from the Franco-Prussian War to 1945. So what? Add 70 years. One of the reasons is because in 1989, things began to happen in Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall fell, and then in 1990, communism fell in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union essentially collapsed in 1990 and 1991. So that by January 28, 1992, President George H.W. Bush, in a State of the Union address, was able to declare that by the grace of God, the United States won the Cold War. It was a half century. People never thought it would happen. But then, like that, it was done. Over. A half century of hostility just over with. So the Americans became kind of like maybe the global hegemon. I read one Popular Mechanics article that said America was no longer a superpower, it was a hyperpower. We had the land, air, sea level capability to do anything we wanted around the world, where we went, and we could get partners. But if we didn't have partners, it didn't matter. We had the ability to do that all by ourselves. But what happened with the end of the Cold War was this. And the fall of the Berlin Wall was that people from Eastern Europe began to migrate from the East to the West. You with me so far? In Eastern Europe, you have a strong presence of Catholicism, which many people still don't like, believe it or not. And then also the Greek Orthodox Church, or Orthodox Christianity. So they're bringing with them their Eastern European ways. A half century into communism, they're not thinking like Western capitalists or entrepreneurs. They're bringing with them their language, their culture from the East to the West. That's the first blow. That's the first jolt that Western Europe has, with the influx of migrants coming into Western Europe that people are not prepared to have. So sure, the Russians being gone is one thing, but all these people coming across from the East to the West, that's something different. You see here the asylum applicants per million. Destination countries with most applicants per million people include Hungary, Sweden, Austria, Germany, Malta, Cyprus, Luxembourg, Bulgaria, Belgium, Denmark, Italy, Greece, France, Finland, the Netherlands, and on it goes. And these are countries of origin that include Kosovo, the Kosovars from the Serbo-Croatian wars of the early 1990s, Syria, Afghanistan. This is more up to date. Let's keep going though. That's the first shock wave. But I'm showing you this picture of Mediterranean Europe for a purpose, obviously. Look at Mediterranean Europe, the Mediterranean Sea. Look at how close in proximity to Southern Europe, North Africa is. Not sub-Saharan Africa. What now is called Black Africa, but for example, Morocco. If you look at Morocco and Spain, the little gap there, that's literally 1 mile separating Morocco from southern Spain. Sitting in Hercules Cave one day while I was working for the Voice of America, on a Voice of America radio site in Casablanca, rather in Tangier, I had lunch one day and looked across the straits. You can see, on a clear day, you can literally see Spain from Africa. Also, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and eventually the Middle East. And then another thing that shocked the world was in 2011, something called the Arab Spring. The story goes like this. In 2011, in the nation of Tunisia, right there, Tunisia, there was a vendor selling his fruits and vegetables. Look, guy's just not trying to make a living, right? He's not living wealthy, not living well, just trying to get from one day to the next. And some Tunisian police came through and started harassing him, saying like, hey, you don't have a permit to do this. And so they confiscated all of his fruits and vegetables. A man out there trying to sell his fruits and vegetables and feed his family. They confiscated his cart and all of his wares. Now he can't do that. So the guy already living at the lower end of things is not being reduced even more by the local police. And Tunisia has an autocrat who's been in power for about 20 years. So the guy just got frustrated, set himself on fire. Like the Vietnamese priest did, the Buddhist priest did in Vietnam that led to so much consternation in America during the 1960s. Set himself on fire and didn't die from it, but had some very bad wounds he eventually died from. But when people saw that, they were like, yeah, why are we letting this go on? He's one of us. There's thousands of us like this. So the Tunisians rose up in rebellion and overthrew their dictator. And people in Libya went, really? Is that right? They did the same thing and overthrew Muammar Gaddafi, who came to power in 1979. Muammar Gaddafi was a murdering, bloodthirsty thug. Let there be no doubt about that. Okay? He was. I mean, President Reagan ran after him 2 times, one for bombing that nightclub in West Germany. I think it was in 1984. Then other acts of terrorism. He's also the one that blew up that 747 over Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. So Gaddafi was a murderer. But his people rose up, overthrew him too, which is a great thing, except for then the country fell into civil war. And then they tried it in Egypt. Hosni Mubarak, who took over from Anwar al-Sadat after President Sadat was assassinated, Hosni Mubarak had been in power for about 20, 30 years. Well, the Egyptians responded differently. Mubarak eventually left, but Egypt is somewhat stable now, but it's under a military dictatorship or military rule every now and then. Then they went further east. They didn't overthrow the king in Jordan. There was an attempt to overthrow the leader in Syria. And that leader's name, you see here, in Tunisia, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali was overthrown in Tunisia, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, King Hamad bin al-Isa al-Khalifa remained in power, but in Syria, Ali Abdullah Saleh was overthrown in Yemen, and now a good number of them are part of the country under the rule, or at least influenced by the Houthis, which are attacking American and European shipping in the Persian Gulf. But in Syria, there was Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad had taken over from his father, Hafiz al-Assad, who brutally crushed the attempt to get rid of him in the 1980s. This is during the 1980s when Lebanon was a war zone again. You had the Druze militia, the Israel fighting against the Christians, all these various militias, Muslim and Christian type. It's just a chaotic mess. When people tried to rise up against Bashar al-Assad, he responded just like his father a decade or two earlier and crushed people using 55-gallon drums of gasoline dropping on his own people. I mean, just brutally reacting. This caused a crisis in the Middle East that led to another outflow migration from where? Syria to Europe. Now stay with me on this. So first the Eastern European migration from east to west, and then from Syria, that eventually end up having people leaving Syria in droves, trying to get away, life, protecting their children. People desperate to do anything. And this time, they're not bringing their Europeanness, even though from the East, they're bringing their what? They're bringing their Middle Easternness, their Syrianness, plus Islam and Arabic. And let's not be coy about this, race. Now, the Europeans have already been trying to adjust, the people in the West have already been trying to adjust to all this. By the early 21st century, by 2011, guess what else the world had gone through? The world had gone through that thing called, remember the economic crisis? 2008, 2009, when everybody got hammered? Again, because Wall Street had been asleep at the wheel or, messing around at the casino table. By the time, I think at its peak, there'll be 7 million people. I've seen numbers as high as 12 million Syrians fleeing toward Europe, fleeing out of the country. 12 million people, 12 million on the move. They called it here's what they called it. They called it the largest refugee crisis since World War II. You understand? World War II, when the Nazis look at a map of Nazi-occupied Europe in 1942, the only nation not occupied by the Nazis in 1942 is the Soviet Union, which has been invaded. And the only one that's got independence is Great Britain. So an island nation, all the rest of them either under Nazi domination or allied with the Nazis and dominated them there. So to have a refugee crisis that big since that time, that's a very big refugee crisis. This map shows you the outflow of migration from Turkey to Hungary, and they're moving across areas and into areas that's called the Schengen region. These are countries that, because of the European Union, the ECC, the European Economic Community, EEC, European Economic Community, and then eventually the European Union, these Schengen companies, I think it's Schengen. These are countries that have decided, because they're all trying to be a United States of Europe, they had abolished their passport requirements and entry requirements. So they have relaxed border entry protocols. So people had free movement across borders, not free, but just, somewhat less restricted. And now all of a sudden, this inflow of people begins to put some strains on folk in Eastern Europe, in Hungary especially. This is another map showing from West Africa and Central Africa into Mediterranean Europe as well. The Italians, the Cretes, the Maltese, Sicilians, the Spanish, they're all getting it because these folk are now coming from where? A conflict going on in the Congo that's been happening since forever, since the 1970s. And also from all kinds of things happening in Central African Republic, not to mention the civil wars that happened in Liberia and Senegal in the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s. In Liberia all by itself, 250,000 people were on the move or were killed. That's a lot for just a small country like that. Not to mention the crisis in Rwanda in 1994, the genocide there. What you don't hear about very often is that right next to Rwanda is Burundi. They've had their own problems with genocidal infractions, yeah. So what do we know? What we know is that it began to have an impact on what people thought about globalism, all that wealth, peace, prosperity stuff. So if you're one of the people who wants to have, tie interconnected economies and politics and policies and, border controls, blah, blah, blah. So that's someone who believes that economic and foreign policy should be planned in an international way rather than according to what is best for one particular country. In other words, never mind what's happening in France and England and Great Britain. We ought to be talking about what's happening here. What about poor me? What about me? Not a bad argument. Not a bad argument, right? Because if I have a job in America, I could care less what's happening in France, really. So the article from 2017 from the Harvard Gazette said this: in Europe, nationalism is rising. Essentially, I can't read the top of that, but in 2015, Hungary and Poland saw hard-right, anti-globalization governments. Now understand, in Hungary and Poland, these are both former countries of the East Bloc. They finally had a taste of freedom. A lot of people left them and went to the West. Then all of a sudden, they've had their own people coming from the East and also from different countries, bringing with them different languages, so they've had a reaction to that. And under Viktor Orban, the Hungarians want to be more Hungarian. We're losing our Hungarianness, they say. One example is happening in France with Marine LePen. Her father has been a hard right conservative, and she has gained some significant ground in elections the last few years. Something happened about maybe a year or so ago, which is kind of like in the penalty box for a moment. The US election and Britain's exit from the EU. Remember all that frothing and controversy about Brexit, leaving the EU? The British did that because the guy that led that movement, Nigel Farage, he said, why should we be worried about what's happening on the continent? Now, Britain's always had this historically. There's Great Britain, which is the European, but then there's continental Europe, then there's Great Britain. So throughout their history, the British have looked at things from the continental standpoint, the warfare going on in Europe, the channel kept them physically separated. They've had different ways of looking at things. So the US election and Britain's exit from the EU are very encouraging to nationalist groups across Europe because for the first time, there's a shift away from international cooperation, sharing sovereignty, building international relations and organizations to addressing the sovereign rights of specific countries. This is why a lot of people were wringing their hands about what happened to USAID recently, United States Agency for International Development. It was a low-cost way of building goodwill on the ground with nations that might otherwise be radicalized into attacking you. Let me put it to you like this. In 2017, when Dr. Vanderstoep and I took students to Vietnam, one of the places we took them was to a women's health program in the northern part of the country, among the Hmong people. Hmong women, so the culture goes, when Hmong women are about to give birth, men are not supposed to be located anywhere in the area. But what happened was that for years and years and years, Hmong women and children have been dying in childbirth because of poor medical care. The Hmong are a minority in Vietnam. They're very poor. So this death of women and children, of course, Vietnamese doctors want to do something about this. So our in-country contact said that he got together with a bunch of female Vietnamese doctors and went to the Hmong people and trained Hmong women to be white midwives, give them prenatal care, care during delivery, care during postnatal. So before birth, during birth, after birth, Hmong women were getting something they hadn't had before. And the death rates went down, or should I say the survival rates went up for both baby and mother. When we got there in 2017, after the 2016 election, we learned from our in-country contact that program had been one of the first things he cut. I asked, how much was it? I think the term was like $100,000, which in Vietnam goes, look, it would go a long way with me. But in Vietnam, that's like millions of dollars. So a program that costs practically nothing compared to our large, trillions of dollar budget every year, that program was doing so much good and it was cut. Why? Because we can. And you need to reach out and claim a victory, especially when it hurts people. So Viktor Orban has become, look, Viktor Orban, a right-wing leader, has been called upon to speak at American political conventions of a certain type. So he's their standard bearer. He's been brought here to say, tell us how you do it. Tell us how you're suppressing people in Hungary. So politicians and the U.S. radical right are now looking to America to see which tactics and messages work, and then testing those in their home nations. That is, they're looking to our elections of 2016 and 2024. They're looking for us to get inspiration and tactics and guidance on how to do it in their countries. What that means is the standard bearer that we used to be, we can't claim that anymore. That is, you cannot look to the United States anymore for how to get free speech or how to have a liberal democracy. When I say liberal democracy, I don't mean liberal as in the way it's been bastardized today. I'm talking about a government that minimizes interference of people's right to freedom and speech and protest. What did King say on April 4th, 1968, April 3rd, 1968, before he was shot down? Remember the speech? He said, I read somewhere that that freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble. He said, I heard that the greatness of America was what? The right to protest for rights. So they're looking to us to see which tactics and messages might work, and then testing those in their home nations, adding to the sense that there's a broader nationalist wave rippling around the world. And I mean, it's one thing to see that happening, I don't know, in maybe Eastern Europe, a small country in Eastern Europe, when it's coming from Washington in America. What are people in the continent of Africa supposed to think they have a dictator? In that kind of world, where do you go to when the Americans have lost faith or seem incapable of delivering that message anymore? Giorgia Meloni, I think she's the granddaughter of Mussolini, right? So she's in office now. Not as far right as people thought she was going to be, but in doing some research on her, she was a member of something called the Youth Fascist League, so that's not encouraging. So what's giving these ideas, given the contextual factors, economic crises, persistent inequality stemming out of neoliberalism, demographic change, fill in the blank, immigration? anxieties associated with terrorism, which are not fake, those are real anxieties. Political developments like obstructionism in Washington, or also known as gridlock in Washington, the perceived corruption or non-representativeness of the EU governance system. That is, people feeling like, you know what, sure, Amazon's doing great, Silicon Valley's doing great, I'm not doing great, so I'm not participating in all that wealth. What about me? I'm not feeling that. So all of these things have generated some level of anxiety among particularly white native-born populations and a perceived status loss at the group level among these folks. Now, in America, that's called, just to put it on the table, there's something called the Great Replacement Theory. Let me explain to you what that means. That in 2000, a book was written called The New White Nationalism. I can't remember the author's name right now. But she said that by the year 2050, America was going to be going through a demographic shift that's called the Browning of America. So that by 2050, some states in the union, like Nevada, Southern California, Texas, New Mexico, will become majority states. I'm still trying to figure out how you can finally get the numbers on your favor still be a minority. But majority states with probably brown people, there's people from Mexican heritage or South American heritage or Central American heritage, not to mention all the biracial people that are going to be born. So the numbers are going to shift, where your traditional population may find the scales like this. That wasn't supposed to happen until 2050. Let me share something with you. In 2008, when Barack Obama, a biracial man, mother from Kansas, father from Kenya, was elected president, some people looked at that and said, okay, 2008, if somebody like that can become the president of the United States, have not one of the most, but the most powerful office in the world, that can happen in 2008, that's 42 years ahead of schedule. My contention is that they reacted to that, they've been on a tear ever since. A black man is president? Are you kidding me? We're not gonna let that happen. Oh no. Which then makes both nationalist and populist claims, especially nationalist populist claims, more resonant and more salient than they had been in the past. All these fears, I'm not getting a piece of the action. I'm not getting my cut of the prosperity, wealth, and health, and all that other business. The demographic shift, I'm losing my traditional hold on power. And let's put in the congressional terms, like if the traditional people that hold power lose their power, that means you lose access to what the branch of government that does what? Holds control of the purse. Economic power. Maybe I start passing legislation that favors these folk over here who, just again, they don't really deserve it. Do they really deserve it? No. No, did that happen? So I mentioned the global financial crisis, which again scared the living out of everybody. People are talking about the Great Recession. They called it the Great Recession because they did not want to introduce the phrase Great Depression, which many people thought was going to be again. Add to that the pandemic. The world got shut down for an entire, 4 or 5 years. And it forced people to pull back in and isolate. And when people were saying, like, you should wear your mask, I can be free to do whatever I want. But you might be supposed to kill other people. I don't care. Okay, what? So people didn't like government overreach. Didn't like it in America, didn't like it in Europe. So here we are. Nationalism on the rise. Nationalism then. 17 years of lost opportunity, that's 1936. That's 17 years of lost opportunity from Versailles, 1919. 17 years, 1936, that's when Hitler marched back into the Ruhr and occupied the Ruhr, the Saar, and the Rhineland. Eventually, in 1938, Nazi troops will be invited into Austria, and they'll be met with hearts and flowers and kisses and roses. And not everybody, of course, in Austria, but they'll march in Anschluss, they call it, Anschluss, out of the country. This is after the Sudeten crisis. And after Munich. Munich is the modern version of Munich, where the world stood by and essentially stabbed Czechoslovakia in the back. When Hitler's representative von Ribbentrop sat down with Neville Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier, and they gave away Czechoslovakia, and the Czech representative wasn't even there to witness it. Hitler wanted the Sudetenland. They said, please, you know what? We'll give you whatever you want. Just please don't take us to war like 1914. And I get that. I understand people did not want to do a part 2 of 1914. They got it anyway, though, didn't they? Didn't they? Updated and worse than the first time. So nationalism then, nationalism today, still marching people off a cliff. Max Boot, very well-respected scholar on foreign affairs, says this: if we turn our backs on globalism and retreat into isolationism, protectionism, we will be back in the 1930s. That didn't work out so well. By contrast, the post-1945 era of globalism, underwritten, guaranteed by the United States through protection, NATO, economic support through the ERA, has made our country the most richest and most powerful and frankly respected in the world. Did we always get our foreign policy right? No, we did not. In fact, at times it was pretty disastrous. But everybody always had this one thing they could count upon with the Americans, that somehow, at some point, we're going to lurch forward and do the right thing. We always had that forward leaning, trying to find our way to do the right thing. They're not getting that anymore. Our challenge is to rescue national identity from nationalism and to create an affirmative nationness that can be a focus of pride and affection without seeking conflict with other politics. Only such a nation and the people of such a nation can successfully trade and treat with each other nations precisely because they know who they are and what they stand for. Okay, I need to show a video. This isn't habit because we just need to see this video. So can we get out of this? And so I can show the video. This guy we're going to watch the video for is the grandson of Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess was the camp commandant of Auschwitz, the worst of the death camps. Get into YouTube.
So Brett asked how I run a business so efficient. And I said, I don't.
This
but
isn't
my
it.
AI team does. I used to think I had to focus on too many tools, too many.
We are at Boca Rio Market. I promise. I know more.
Okay.
I know more than most people about the.
Okay. I figured this is always a good one to end on. Well, it's not good to end on, but it gets the point across. Rainer Hess was the grandson of Rudolf Hess, who was camp commandant at Auschwitz from 1942 until the end of the war. He was eventually tried at Nuremberg in 1946. Of course, he was found guilty and executed. Auschwitz was the worst of the death camps, which is saying something since they all were horrible. It was the absolute worst of the worst. I visited Dachau in the late 80s, early 90s. I cannot tell you that when you walk in, if you have never visited the camps, if you decide to go, it's not a destination place that people voluntarily or enthusiastically go to, but if you do visit, at least for me, when I walked inside the gate and walked past the never forget part, sign out front, you still feel the presence of a great tragedy that just on the basis of never mind your language, your race, where you come from, your humanity will just be oppressed about what happened there. You walk into that zone, you know there's something cataclysmic that should never have happened. And human history did. State-sanctioned industrial murder that the United States knew about, could do nothing about, but still knew about. And then the really heartbreaking part is that in the 20th and 21st century, there are Holocaust deniers with the evidence which is so replete. And the thing is, the Holocaust deniers are growing in number. They made it up. 6 million people. It's why I told you all the story that in 1945, when Dwight Eisenhower visited Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, what he saw there was astonishing. His Eisenhower and George Patton, men of war, they both West Point graduates, they have been in World War I and World War II. These men have known warfare and strife and killing all their lives. And Eisenhower, in a series of letters from himself to Patton, said, walked back to Washington and said, send every reporter, every cameraman, every camera photographer you can find here right now. Because my fear is that at some point, there'll be those who will say that we just made this up as propaganda. Here's what I always wondered. How did Eisenhower know to warn people about that? He said that in 1945, while the war's still going on. Get the evidence on record. Get the photographs, because there'll be somebody out there who will be demented enough to say it never happened. And for that reason, Dwight Eisenhower is one of my heroes. Because his humanity said, we can't let this happen again. So at least if you have the evidence, they say it didn't happen, you can at least offset that with some argument. Because, you know, human beings will believe what they want to believe. We've seen that. We're seeing that right now.
I know more than most people about the desire to forget. There have been times when I wanted to deny my past, pretend I was someone else. But we must never forget our past, no matter how much it hurts. Because when we forget, history will repeat itself. I fear that this is happening right now. All over Europe, far-right political parties are gaining ground. And if we do nothing, we have learned nothing. My name is Rainer Höss. My grandfather was Rudolf Höss, the Nazi commandant of the Auschwitz extermination camp. My history taught me that democracy, equality, and human rights never can be taken for granted. Never forget to vote.
And that may be the only way I recommend to stop what's going on. Through the political system that is still functioning, such as it is. But, folk, I don't know if you've been watching. USAID has been pretty much effectively shuttered. The news I got yesterday was that $7 million have been cut off from education like that for no reason. How many of you all saw that graduation from the Hope Western Prison Education Program back on June 25th? Okay. Let me tell you something about, I teach in that program out there in Muskegon. Those men are some of the best students I've ever had. Because they're in the joint. And here's what they reckon. The average age, according to Dr. Rich Ray, Rich said that the average age of those men is 47 years old. That's 47 years old. Some of them have been in there since they were 16, 17, 18 years old in the correction system. 18 years old, now 47. That's 28 years. Some of them, like one student I had last semester, Troy told me, he said, nah, man, he said, I'm never getting out of here. He's got like a 60-year sentence. Troy's in his 60s now. So unless human lifespans have a different statistic, he's going to be there until, you know, it's done. But the one thing I notice about all those men is this. They are hungry for education. Because they now, at 47 years old, they have the maturity to know that if I had had an education, I know that my life would have been different because I would have been thinking differently and making different decisions. If I've been thinking critically, I am not at all. My firm belief is this: whenever somebody is trying to keep education out of your hands, it's not because they're worried about, the education, it's because they're worried about power. It's the reason why slaveholders did not want slaves to learn how to read. Frederick Douglass said, an educated man is unfit to be a slave. Well, you can hold him, but he'll never be a slave. Not inside of here. You can do that only if a man's mind is untrained, uneducated, and empty. So when they come to class, they're ready to learn because they realize now what education could have done for them. And now that they have a second shot at it, they're not letting it go by. They don't have access to internet. You can't take an iWatch in there. You can't take a cell phone in there. You got to walk in there with just your keys, your driver's license, and that's it. So the papers they write for me are by hand or on typewriters, on whatever paper they can find. It's very rough. But the brilliance that they're demonstrating, what they've learned, they learn theology, philosophy, history, languages, and so forth, to make them better citizens for if and when they get out. And last December 2024, 2 of them did get out. And what happened in the parking lot there was that there were professors from Hope College, Western Theological Seminary, their families, all this big throng of people out there, welcoming them back into freedom, hugs and kisses and all kind of praising to God. Only thing missing, as I tell people, only thing missing was the burning bush. But truly a God moment. So one thing, cutting out $7 million of education to the most needy, most likely not to get a good education, is simply going to add one more pipeline to places like the MDOC. That's not for the benefit of the country. It's not for the benefit of the general population. That is simply nothing more as an exercise of power to consolidate more power. I told people that for the last 2-3 years, my biggest concern has not been race. It is still that. But mine has been the survival of this constitutional republic, this democratic republic. We still are the essential nation for the world, because most people around the world looking at their options, who'd you rather follow? China, North Korea, Europe? To still say America for the moment. But I don't know how much we can last to keep earning that moniker. It seems to be that everything's being done to just disintegrate that. And what breaks my heart about USAID, I saw a woman in the Meru district of Kenya, a woman who had AIDS. Her children were gathered around her, about 8 kids. She had AIDS. Under President Bush, George W. Bush, his injection of funds into Africa caused the AIDS rate in South Africa to go down so significantly, keeping people alive, because they finally had the drugs to keep people alive, take care of the kids. I sat there, this woman was barely alive that day. Her kids just didn't know what to do. After mom was gone, what do we do? I don't know. Those funds from USAID had real impact on the ground. But when you have a mindset that goes like, the hell with you, I'm gonna take care of me, I understand that. But sometimes the hell with you means that you might get radicalized and come for me, doesn't it? Not to mention, just as a matter of humanity and decency. That's the rise of Europe. That's the rise of nationalism in Europe. We have a problem, and we need to fix it. They're taking their cues from us, the United States of America. We need to send them the right cues. Can we start doing that? Can we start doing that? Thank you. Yes. I will take you all's questions. We finally had time for some.
My nephew lives in Berlin, and in a recent conversation, he was telling me that Germany, because of the current political situation and the change in policy in Washington, that Germany is now overcoming 80 years of their horror at the part that their country played in 2 world wars, and are now talking about rearming themselves.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, there's also a growing neo-Nazi movement in Germany, where the Germans have, we're taught about the Holocaust in schools, and they're kind of pulling back from that a little bit. And let's just say that the national sense that we somehow or another we're at the center of some really horrible human thing, We want people to know about that, so we don't do that again. That's still there, but from what I've been reading, the acuteness of that, it's not as sharp as it used to be. That's kind of like, it wasn't really all that bad, and more people asking, well, did it really happen? So yeah, and they're also, talking about doing similarly in Japan, right? Having the Japanese rearm themselves. Now, at the end of World War II, General Douglas MacArthur single-handedly almost wrote the Japanese Constitution that put in the fact that they would have like a naval defense, like kind of like a Coast Guard, and some other things. But the Japanese, they have not wanted to rearm, but you know what? They're not going to live in a neighborhood with North Korea and not defend themselves. That's all of East Asia. So if you're talking about East Asia, Japan, kids think about Japan and North Korea, got to think about what they call Australasia. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Singapore, that entire region over there. And that's also the Russian Far East. So it's not just confined to one country, but yes, in Germany, that's going on. And now there's still a great deal of consternation between East and West Germans because of the fall of the wall. And sometimes I was going to show you all a video where some towns in East Germany have become depopulated because of the people fleeing to the West. And a lot of resentment about the fact that people in the West prospered more than people in the East did. And that here, 2-3 decades after the wall fell, they still haven't caught up. And people are feeling that. And look, I understand this. Again, it's politics of the stomach. When I'm hungry, I don't care where the food comes from. I just want to be fed. So they might follow somebody who might not have the best interest for a democracy. See? Yes.
Who hasn't heard Trump say we won't have to vote?
Oh, yeah.
So,
Well, something we should not dismiss anything.
I mean,
we should not dismiss anything that he says.
you can't dismiss everything he says. He's saying that what he.
Here's the problem. The problem, of course, if it gets to that will be a problem. Here's the problem. The problem is the fact that he said it, period. No American president has ever said that before. Not that I know of. So an American president says, trust me, you don't have to vote anymore. The mere fact that he felt confident to say that is the problem. Because something there says that the Congress has abdicated its Article I powers to the extent that, trust me, I can do it. That's the same message given by somebody else in 1933 to say, trust me, I'll fix it for you. You saw how that turned out. And look, I just tell y'all straight up, the people, if this democracy folds, the people that are going to be impacted hardest, worst, and fastest and longest by it will be people of color, women, and immigrants. Because they're the ones that need democracy the most. And of course, in sliding scale, those are economically disadvantaged because who needs democracy more than the people that need democracy? But there's not enough engagement there. Yes. Rick?
Fred, I have two questions
Yes,
and
sir.
they sort of go together. The first problem is that my wife and I are members of First United Methodist Church, and we have the Refresh Ministry. And without going into any big details, we had a great idea there, but we found out most of the homeless men, again, repeat men, but wanted one thing, macho man, macho man. That was the song they were singing,
Yep.
and Trump was their dream come true.
Yep.
Now you think of these people, they are homeless, they are naked. Well, not naked, but I mean, they're basically living on nothing. The second question I have for you relates to that. I was at a conference last week in Chicago with my financial planners of creative planning, and they had a speaker that explained that in 1925, there were for every single person who had a 65th birthday or later. Now, again, medicine is not that good. There were 6 people age 16 and under. Okay.
Mhm.
And of course, no birth control pills. Today, for every person over 65, there is 2/3 of a person 16 and under. So the population is substantially bigger over 65, because it goes on past 81,
Yeah.
than it is under 16.
Yeah.
Can you comment on those two comments?
The second one, the second statistic I'm less familiar with about the population demographics, other than the fact that the people who will be left to run the political system are less informed, they are less aware of their history, and you can't know like Reiner said, if you don't know the past, you're inclined to do the past again. Somebody says, you shouldn't do it because that happened before. What happened before? Well, that's your problem, right? That's the first thing. And the second thing about the whole idea of macho man culture and so forth, that is a cultural thing. I don't know how that has continued to manifest, perpetuate, and I don't know what we can do to change that. My own response is, for myself, it is to embrace even more so the legacy and model of Jesus the Christ, right? Who was a man's man, but also cried at the death of friends, who had compassion, who was a carpenter, who had, rough hands, strong forearms. I mean, nobody would deny he was a man's man, but not the kind of men that are emulated today. How do we get that? By doing more of this kind of thing, I suppose.
Morning, Professor.
Yes.
Thank you
Good
for
morning.
being here and teaching us. It's
You're
a
welcome.
great
Thank you.
lecture, and you're an
Thank you.
incredible speaker.
Thank you. Thank you.
You said early on in your lecture that you couldn't understand why anyone would follow an autocrat. And my question is, we have more than half the people in this country who are endorsing and following and accepting what an autocrat is doing. I'm having a hard time talking to these people. And these are people in my own family.
Mhm.
These are my friends, people in my community, and they will not talk about this, or they just get angry and shut down.
Mhm.
What is the motivation? Why are these people supporting an autocrat? What is it about them, their lives, that more than half the people in this country feel they need to follow someone like this?
I think part of it is grievance. There are people getting things that they don't deserve. Think about the attack on universities and education. Why are we allowing people to come inside this country who don't deserve to be here? Well, that's a whole discussion all by itself, isn't it? So, and many people legitimately feel like they've been left out of the success of the United States. Again, when President Biden was going around talking about, the stock market is doing great. I don't care less. Okay, if my 401k has been zeroed out, I care less what the stock market is doing. So they have lost faith in politics. This is multi-generational, starting from lies about Vietnam. They lied about Vietnam, and then there were lies about the Great Recession. There are more lies, and so lies from Nixon and Watergate. So dissatisfaction with the political system, the Great Recession, the pandemic, then just this general feeling of the fact that I've been left out. My shares been going to somebody else, and there's some other underlying features there that have to do with demographics, right? People think that we're just being overrun, and again, statistically, you can look at the number of people deported by Barack Obama is still in excess of the last two presidents. But keep on hollering statistics about, they come in waves and waves and ways. But you say anything long enough, either Joseph Stalin or Joseph Goebbels said that you tell a lie long enough, the bigger the lie, it'll become the truth. And so this person is nothing if not having mastered the art of telling lies repeatedly bigger every day, relentlessly, flooding the zone, as they call it. And I would also say, too, that the dismantling of education, especially liberal arts education, where people are taught to think critically, engage in civil conversation. In other words, Hope College's mission, to think critically, to think theologically, to discuss things of civility, which does not mean agree, just means to be able to disagree without being disagreeable. And then the fact that somehow or another along the way, people got the green light that political violence became normalized and acceptable. We're seeing a spike in anti-Semitism again. So here's the thing, right? And because it's a spike again, what that means is that these things didn't go away. They went into like a stasis period. I told friends of mine back in Washington, D.C., I said, you know what? The thing I was kind of celebrating at one point was the fact that some of the awful things that they were saying about race and whatnot, people finally got into a point where they weren't saying them. Somebody said, well, my grandfather, he's not a racist. He just thinks he's saying what a lot of people are thinking. I said, well, from my standpoint, your grandfather may not be a racist, but he's supporting one. So that kind of lands in the same spot for me, right? So these things have been normalized again. They not only have been normalized, but they've been made fashionable to the point of shooting at firefighters in Idaho and Oregon. So look, as an educator, I have to believe that a bulwark against all this stuff is stronger education, more and more education. Well, particularly historical education. Shameless plug. Yes, ma'am.
Is it during the 2020 election, there were more people who did not vote
Mhm.
than voted for either candidate for president. Last week, I became aware of a movement to attempt in Michigan to have ranked choice voting. What is that a possible remedy for getting more people to vote because they don't have to choose necessarily between one of two candidates, but there are other choices?
I had tried to follow ranked choice voting in like the most recent Democratic primary in New York for the mayoral race. It's very confusing. It's very confusing. So I don't know if I don't know if that would be a solution. But here's the thing. I would say that again, Americans taking their responsibility to participate in their electoral process, which means voting. That's all you have to do. But people, okay, you can sit home and not vote. But if you sit home and don't vote, then you can't talk to me. You can't complain. You can't extol. You can't do anything because you abdicated your responsibility as an American citizen, guaranteed by or at least allowed by the Constitution. And by the way, did you all hear that their birthright citizenship, that they are denaturalizing people now? They're looking at that. You know what? We fought a civil war to handle that issue because in 1865, when the war ended, there were 4 million Black people in this country who just about a day or two earlier had been called property. The Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865. On April 10th, 1865, they were still what? Property. They didn't come across the border. They didn't parachute in from Egypt. They've been born right here in America. So what do you do with 4 million people who are property but now are not? 14th Amendment. They are citizens of the state in which they live in, the country to which that state belongs. Dual citizenship. Guaranteed. No other country on the planet, you can go from someplace else and become an American or become whatever you are. You can go from America to Norway. You can't become Norwegian though. You can have dual citizenship, but you can become an American from any place. That's under threat as well. So my preference would be people just get out and vote. But that, of course, is why they're doing everything they can to prevent that, right? Like the motor voter, and the mail-in ballots, all that kind of stuff. Anything to prevent voting or obstruct voting or restrict voting or slow down voting. It's why a few years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the former Confederate states or the further segregationist states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, oh, they're not racist anymore. They just let them police themselves. Seriously? Really? You think that? I mean, I'm not saying that they can't finally redeem themselves and become more modern, but as we are seeing, what do they say in fashion? That which is old becomes new, and that which is new becomes old, and again and again. And so it goes. Yes.
Fred,
Milt,
thank
please.
you for another excellent talk. Every time I hear you lecture, I feel like I'm sitting at the master's feet.
Milt,
I
I'm gonna
do
take you
wanna-
to lunch. I'm gonna take you to lunch because you said that in front of my sister.
I do want to try to inject a positive note amidst all this gloom and doom. Mary and I were in Berlin a few weeks ago, our first trip there. And I was impressed with how the Germans are coming to terms with their dark history.
Yeah.
Specifically with 2 venues that we visited. One was a Holocaust memorial. I don't know how many of you have been there. A full city block covered with concrete blocks shaped like coffins, different heights and so forth. There must have been several thousand right in downtown Berlin.
Yeah.
A lot of people were visiting that site when we were there. And the other is a former SS headquarters.
Yes. They should stop them.
Which has been converted into what they call a museum of terror.
Yes, yes.
that portrays how the Third Reich came into power.
Wow.
And these are two of the most popular, for lack of a better word, tourist sites in Berlin. They're, they actively promote these things. The other positive note is that a week ago, Monday, we were back at Auschwitz. This was our first time back in 21 years, I think.
Yeah.
Since we filmed the documentary.
Tova, right? Tova.
Pardon?
Tova?
Tova Friedman,
Yeah.
she was one of the subjects. We had a guide. We made a day trip from Krakow where we were visiting our son and his family. And he told us that the number of visitors at Auschwitz has increased fourfold since the year 2000. From 500,000 a year to a projected 2 million this year. That's a good sign.
That is a good sign.
People are paying attention.
That is a good sign.
And that, will help, should prevent another Holocaust from happening. I mean, it comes back to this theme of never forget.
What you're tapping into, Milt, is that the Europeans have been a lot more forthright, especially post 1945, about confronting their history. Now, the Japanese, not so much, right? They still talk about, how horrible Hiroshima was, and Hiroshima was horrible. But they kind of like, leave out that thing about Pearl Harbor, Bataan Death March, and all the other things, Japanese hell ships and all that kind of stuff. So they're very select. But the Europeans, not all, but as you're pointing out, and especially in Germany. Why? Because, and the Germans have left a good part of World War II. It's still like bombed-out buildings are still there. The Germans have made sure that World War II is alive and well. You can go down, you can drive down the street and see it. So it's not hidden. In fact, it's not a stretch to say that Germany has been more forthright about confronting its past. We have about ours, particularly from 1619 to 1865. Or if you will, 1865 to 1954 or 68. So that is a good sign that people, and I think that, Mill, that reaction is if the visitation at Auschwitz has increased, it's because people are aware of this rising nationalism. They're worried enough about it. They're going to see those places because they want to see firsthand the last time this happened. It may not be the same thing, but we don't even want to facsimile what happened the last time. That's good to know. Isn't it good to know?
It's good.
Maybe we can take the lead from them. Kit?
Yes, I wanted to mention because Milt brought up the idea that they were in Berlin. Look forward to next term because Fred is going to be doing 2 sessions on the Holocaust denial. So that is something that we're all going to be looking forward to. And we have another question. I think it's your dear sister over there who has a question for you.
Okay. The word that came to mind was ambush, but go ahead.
Where did your love of history come from or originate from?
I don't know if I told you all the story. I think maybe I told you all the story. When I was 14 years old, I got beat up by the Prince George's County Police. I mean, to within an inch of my life. And back when I got beat up, the PG County Police Force was predominantly white. PG County was predominantly black. And, growing up on an Air Force base in the Philippines, we didn't come from the Philippines until I was like 9 or 10 years old. So I thought of myself as being more Filipino than American. I spoke Tagalog. With my friends, we rode on the back of water buffaloes, played in rice paddies. So I thought I was Filipino. But when that happened to me, when you saw how Filipinos reacted to Americans in, at that age before, while Vietnam War was still going on, Americans were golden in the Philippines. General MacArthur waiting ashore and getting the Japanese out of the Philippines, the Japanese horrible occupiers. So the American nations looked upon it as being liberated. So, that was the history I was fed, America coming to the rescue. And that was a good image to have. Plus growing up on shows like 12 O'Clock High, the Rat Patrol, and playing with G.I. Joe dolls and all that stuff. I was all down with the military and American history. But when that happened, there was a disconnect. I said, okay, the America I learned about is not the America that just beat me to death nearly. And the question I had was, how can that America produce this effect? And I started reading and I said, it must be the Civil War. The answer's got to be there. That's where things went sideways. During 4 years of conflict, where the country went so backwards. I mean, how do you get from Abraham Lincoln saying, fourscore years ago, our fathers established this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. I mean, that was brand new stuff in 1776. But then the president said, and now we're in a great civil war. How do you find fault with conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men and women are created? What's wrong with those ideas? Who wants to fight about that? But they did for 4 years, a bloody 4-year fratricidal conflict over conceived in liberty and dedicated to all men being equal. What's the problem with that? And so whatever that problem is, the answer must be in history. That's where it came from. You all have been great. Thank you for this morning.